It's another year, and it's another NBA All-Star weekend. This year's game will be in the Midwest. It'll be in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we have all of the previews. Weatherby will go over the All-Star rosters, also the All-Star weekend, which is always a lot of fun with the three-point shootout, the Rising Stars Challenge, Slam Dunk Contest, just to name a few. And a gentleman that I've had on the program for quite a long time, always knowledgeable, always someone that knows his NBA, knows his basketball. Let's welcome him back to the program. He is a writer and editor-in-chief for No Ceilings NBA, also host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and he's the co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast, which is dedicated to anything and everything related to the NBA's Sacramento Kings. Let's welcome him back to the program, Nick Agar-Johnson. Hey, Nick, what's going on, my man?
Hey, Ed, thanks so much for having me back. It's another year, another All-Star break, and another opportunity to have a great chat with you about the upcoming All-Star festivities. So really happy to be back and happy to get into it with you.
Absolutely, Nick. And as always, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on the program. So again, it's another NBA All-Star weekend, and we've got all of the festivities for this weekend, and the game is taking place this year in Indianapolis. And let's start off with talking about the All-Star rosters. Let's start off with the starters in the Eastern Conference and the guards. I want to start off talking about Tyrese Haliburton from the Indiana Pacers. What a first half of the year it's been for Tyrese. Tyrese really had his coming out party in the NBA in-season tournament in Las Vegas back in December. And, man, you talk about one of the rising stars in the league. You're familiar with him, Nick. He played for the Sacramento Kings for a few seasons before being traded to the Pacers. But, man, this is his second All-Star appearance. Give me your thoughts on Tyrese making the All-Star team.
I always love to see good things happen for Tyrese Haliburton. As you mentioned, he was a former Sacramento King, and he was an absolute joy to watch with the Kings, and he continues to be an absolute joy to watch with the Pacers. He's got such a fun, sort of infectious style of playmaking, getting everybody else on the team involved, obviously leading the NBA in assists. But, as you mentioned, he had sort of a bigger coming out party to the rest of the world with his performance in the in-season tournament. But any Kings fan and any Indiana Pacers fan is very familiar with his game, and it's great to see him starting the All-Star game in Indianapolis, of course, but, it's an honor that he would have deserved no matter where he was playing in the NBA. If the All-Star game were in Cleveland this year, he would still be very much a deserved All-Star starter, and, again, it's just so much fun to watch him succeed, and, that trade is certainly one that Kings and Pacers fans will keep at the top of their minds for a long time as one that really, in a way, helped out both teams to sort of become the fully realized versions of themselves. So it's always great to see Tyrese succeed as a former Kings fan, and it's great, of course, that he'll be starting in Indiana for this All-Star game, but just so much fun to watch and really always awesome to see him doing well.
Absolutely, and kudos to Tyrese. We're going to talk Tyrese again in just a little bit about something that he caused a little controversy with a statement that he made. We'll get back to Tyrese in just a little bit, but again, congratulations to him on making the All-Star team. This is his second All-Star appearance. Let's talk about somebody else that's going to be in the backcourt with Tyrese, the other guard, Damian Lillard, a.k.a. Dame Dollar. So many great seasons with the Portland Trail Blazers. This is his first year with the Milwaukee Bucks. Of course, came to Milwaukee from that blockbuster trade in the offseason with Portland. This is going to be his 8th All-Star appearance. Your thoughts on Damian making another All-Star team?
I mean, it's not a surprise that Damian Lillard is once again an All-Star starter, because he's doing it in the opposite conference from where people might be used to seeing him doesn't mean that it's a particular surprise that he's an All-Star. The Bucks have had a very interesting season overall. But ultimately, I mean, their two lead guys are starting the All-Star game. I'm sure we'll get to Giannis in just a minute, but it's not a surprise. I mean, Dame, it was interesting. He had a bit of a sort of slower start than some maybe would have anticipated in Milwaukee, but he's certainly been putting it together since really that first couple of weeks. And again, not a surprise to see him in the All-Star game, but it is nice to see that his game hasn't dropped off at all since he got traded to Milwaukee. And certainly I would expect this to not be anywhere near his last All-Star appearance.
All right, rightfully so, and Damian Lillard makes another All-Star appearance. This is his first one as a member of the Milwaukee Bucks, and you mentioned his name, and let's move over to the forwards now. So at the forward position, we have his teammate representing the Milwaukee Bucks, Giannis Antetokounmpo, his 8th All-Star appearance. Again, he's at the peak of his powers right now in terms of being one of the best, not just in the NBA, but in all of the world, representing what the world players have to offer, just foreign players, what they have to offer to the NBA. Your thoughts on Giannis making another All-Star team?
Giannis is in the middle of yet another spectacular season. I mean, he's on pace to break records with his 30-point-a-game average and his ridiculous efficiency. I mean, currently shooting 62% from the floor. Just absurd numbers from Giannis, and, you know, it's been very interesting to sort of see, in a way, is the evolution of his game, but really a lot of it is just what has been unlocked for him by Damian Lillard's presence, in that, you know, Giannis doesn't necessarily have to be the closer for this team anymore. He can just sort of do what he does best, you know, not really have to force any shots like he had to when he didn't have the help of Damian Lillard alongside him. And again, just a ridiculously efficient season from Giannis. As you mentioned, you know, still at the peak of his powers, and, you know, maybe not winning back-to-back MVPs right now like he was a few years ago, but none of that is due to anything on his end. You know, it's just him sort of continuing to be in a league with a lot of incredible stars around him. But the incredible efficiency that Giannis has put together this season is truly something to behold, genuinely record-breaking. And, you know, with Giannis and the Bucks, again, it's been a very sort of rocky bit of the season since Doc Rivers became the head coach. And, you know, the situation with Adrian Griffin being fired 53 games into his first season as coach is certainly a bit of a surprise, as, you know, someone who's a bit of an outsider in terms of the Bucks front office and those sorts of dealings. But, again, Giannis has been the calm throughout the storm that has been this Bucks season, and him continuing to average 30 points a game, but increasing his efficiency even further when he was already, you know, one of the league's most efficient players. It's something to behold, and, you know, Giannis at the peak of his powers is always an incredible watch, and hopefully he'll remain at this kind of level for a long time to come.
Absolutely, and his story just going from Greece, coming over to America and landing in Milwaukee is just amazing, and since he's been in America, been with the Milwaukee Bucks, he's had a great career, and I think the best is yet to come for Giannis Antetokounmpo making another All-Star appearance. This is his 8th All-Star selection. The other forward, one of my favorites in the league, Jason Tatum, representing the Boston Celtics. This is going to be his 5th All-Star appearance. Jason just continues to get better year in and year out. Talent, I mean, just phenomenal. Boston, they know how to pick their talent. Give me your thoughts on Jason making another All-Star team.
Yes, Boston definitely knows how to pick their talent. I mean, they're 43-12 right now for a reason, and the biggest of those reasons continues to be Jason Tatum. I mean, he's someone who, you know, we've seen as sort of one of the stars of the league for quite a long time now, but, you know, it is almost difficult to remember just how good he was, how quickly, and he's certainly someone who I learned a lot from as sort of a draft evaluator about, you know, the kinds of things that are most important in evaluating players. I was not anywhere near as high on Jason Tatum as I should have been coming out of the draft, and I'd like to think that I've learned from that. But, I mean, from day one in the league, you know, competing for a Rookie of the Year award with the Celtics in year one, you know, making conference finals, being an All-Star in year 3, being an All-NBA player in year 3, making the All-NBA first team each of the last 2 years, you know, earning MVP votes down ballot, but increasingly working his way up that MVP ballot as his career goes along. This Celtics team has been an absolute juggernaut this season, and again, Jason Tatum is really the leader of that team, you know, both in terms of sort of his talent, but, you know, also the way that he's continued to up his game, you know, continued to get better as a playmaker over the course of his career. That's been a really great development to see from him, and you know, yet again, another very much deserved All-Star selection from Jason Tatum. And again, you know, someone who is going to be starting in these All-Star games for quite a while to come.
Absolutely, and the best is going to get better. Jason Tatum just turned 25, so he is definitely, I don't think he's even hit his prime yet, and certainly the best is definitely yet to come for Jason Tatum from the Boston Celtics, making his 5th All-Star appearance. And at the center position, he will not be participating in this year's All-Star game due to an injury, but If Joel Embiid had not gotten hurt, I think Joel had an opportunity to win back-to-back MVPs. He may have a chance, but we'll have to see pending with Giannis and Jason and, of course, with Nikola Jokic. But Joel Embiid, wow, another All-Star selection representing the Philadelphia 76ers. This is his 7th All-Star appearance. Your thoughts on Joel making the team?
I mean, he was always going to make the team. I think it's obviously really unfortunate that yet again he's struggling with injuries. I mean, that was the story of the first couple of years of his career, of course, where, famously he missed the first 2 years of his career after being drafted by the Sixers with various injuries, with really a foot injury in particular. But, ever since that moment, he's just been one of the clear best players in the NBA every time he steps on the court. I mean, he averaged 20 points a game during his truncated rookie season. He was an all-star in year 2. And with Joel Embiid, essentially, if he's able to, play enough games to sort of make it into qualification for all-star or things of that nature, he's always going to be one of the leading candidates. And, it definitely seems, unfortunately, like he will not be able to sort of put his name into the hat for challenging again for the MVP, especially, given the new missed games related thresholds that they've put into place this year for the first time, where you have to play, I believe it's 65 games to be eligible for any of the end of year awards. So Joel isn't going to meet that threshold, unfortunately, due to his injury, but just another absolutely spectacular season from him. I mean, in many ways, his best season yet, pretty close to career highs in three-point shooting. Obviously, his career high, ridiculous 35 points a game, continuing to be the driving force of a Sixers team that's on the way up. He had his, 70-point game, of course, also earlier this season. He's a spectacular player, and as always, it's really unfortunate to see injuries be the story for him. But, I mean, from my perspective, it's just been so wonderful to see the success that he had when he finally was able to overcome that injury bug that haunted him so aggressively during the first couple years of his career. And, as an NBA fan, certainly as a Sixers fan, you have to hope that this isn't something that sticks with him. But even as an NBA fan, you want this to be the kind of thing where, it's a meniscus injury and you hope that it's something that, he can have to repair, come back and be fully himself again, because it's really sad when the story of Joel Embiid is injuries, because when he is healthy, which, he mostly has been over the past 5-6 seasons, he's just one of the absolute most fun players in the NBA to watch. So sad that he won't be able to be there for this All-Star game, but a very deserved selection, of course.
Absolutely, and Joel Embiid is definitely one of those players that is just hitting his prime, and certainly he means so much, not just to the Philadelphia 76ers, but to the whole NBA as well. And as you said it, Nick, it's tough for him not to participate in this year's game due to injury, but when he comes back, he's definitely going to attack with a vengeance. And that takes care of our starters for the Eastern Conference. The guards, Tyrese Haliburton and Damian Lillard. The forwards, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Jason Tatum. And the center is Joel Embiid. All right, let's get to the reserves now. So let's start off at the guard position. I think this is long overdue and well-deserved. Jalen Brunson making his first All-Star team representing the New York Knicks. Nick, we saw the talent during his time with the Dallas Mavericks, but the New York Knicks have been one of those surging teams in the first half of the year. And Jalen Brunson, man, he's definitely a candidate, knock on wood, if all goes well, is an MVP candidate this year. Give me your thoughts on Jalen making his first All-Star team.
Man, his breakout with the Knicks has been truly spectacular to watch. And, as you mentioned, he's someone who has been a, rising star in the league for quite a while now. I mean, going from being a second-round pick to cementing himself with the Dallas Mavericks almost immediately. I mean, starting more than half his games his rookie year, having a really solid, six-man contending season in year 3 in Dallas. And since he's been traded to the Knicks, he has really just taken the reins of that team. And, having grown up in New York, I know it's a city that loves its point guards and that loves its, tough, gritty, hard-nosed players, and that is Jalen Brunson to a T. And, I mean, he was spectacular for the Knicks in the playoffs last season, and he's really continued to bring that over into this year. And, last year he was sort of on very close but didn't quite make the All-Star game. This year he was a no-doubt selection for the Knicks, just having a spectacular year. I mean, just under 28 points a game on really efficient 48, 41, 84 shooting splits, continuing to move the ball around, him and Julius Randle doing a lot of playmaking for this New York Knicks squad. And, man, it's very clear that, it's a city that New York is a city that loves Jalen Brunson, and, he's someone who has come in, cemented himself almost immediately as essentially the point guard that the Knicks have been looking for since Jeremy Lin had his Linsanity breakout. I mean, other than that, it's been a rocky road for Knicks point guards, and Jalen Brunson has almost made that a thing of the past essentially immediately. And I highly doubt, especially if he continues to, be the lead guy for the Knicks, I highly doubt that this is his last All-Star selection.
I highly doubt that too, Nick, and certainly well-deserved. And as you mentioned about New York, they love their basketball, and they love that gritty, tough play, and they love their point guards. And certainly Jalen Brunson is certainly one of those people responsible for the resurgence of the New York Knicks in the first half of the year. And again, Jalen Brunson makes his first All-Star team as a member of the New York Knicks. Let's stay with the guards for a moment, and making his first All-Star team representing the Philadelphia 76ers, Tyrese Maxey. Tyrese had a breakout year last year. Of course, his teammate Joel Embiid won the league MVP last year, but we saw Tyrese Maxey really take his game to another notch, and this year he has been phenomenal. Well-deserved selection for Tyrese. Your thoughts on Tyrese making the team?
Yeah, this is one that I think has been quite a while in the making at this point. I mean, as you mentioned, last year he really had his breakout year, but even the year before, I mean, he went from, being a very important rotational player as a rookie to being a starter and a key starter for the Sixers in year two. So, him getting to the All-Star game in year 4 is really just a continuation of what we've seen from him the last 3 seasons. But, again, as you mentioned, he really did, have a breakout last year, clear the 20-point-a-game threshold, and, help the 76ers team to, through their sort of playoff run, as it were, even though it wasn't as long as they might have liked. I mean, Tyrese Maxey has been sort of a breakout player candidate for quite a bit now, and he's had to shoulder a lot more of the offensive responsibility this year, even when Joel Embiid was in the picture, and certainly with Joel Embiid out of the picture for the rest of the season, it seems like Tyrese is trying to, make an end-of-the-season run, maybe even make an end-of-the-season run at one of the All-NBA teams, but even if he doesn't quite reach those heights, it's another very key step in his development to sort of reach the all-star threshold like he has this year. And, again, much deserved. He's had a fantastic year, and certainly there's a lot more to come from him this season as the primary guy for the Philadelphia 76ers. But once again, I mean, a player absolutely on the rise, and at only 23 years old, he's really put himself on an incredible trajectory at this point in his young career.
You're absolutely right, Nick. And Tyrese Maxey is certainly someone that fits the Philadelphia 76ers model, kind of like a hand in glove, so to speak. And he's definitely, like you said, 2 years ago, could have gone to an all-star team or could have played in one last year, but definitely deserving of it. So Tyrese Maxey of the Philadelphia 76ers goes to his first all-star team. We stay with the guards again, and Donovan Mitchell, a.k.a. Spider, representing the Cleveland Cavaliers. This is his 5th all-star selection. And Donovan, again, you talk about one of the most high-profile players in the league, one of the most high-impact players in the league. He still has that energy. He fits that Cavaliers team so well. And Donovan, he did it in Utah, and he's continuing to do it in Cleveland. Your thoughts on Donovan making another all-star team?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all that Donovan Mitchell made another all-star team. He's in the middle of a spectacular season, and I think a season that's gone under the radar a little bit in that people have, I think, not realized just how ridiculously good the Cleveland Cavaliers have been since the start of 2024. I mean, on January 1st, they were 18-15 after losing to the Toronto Raptors. Since then, they have lost 2 games. They've gone 18-2 since January 1st, and a lot of that is that Evan Mobley and Darius Garland came back from their injuries, but this Cavaliers team was doing spectacularly well, even with Garland and Mobley on the shelf. And Donovan Mitchell is the guy who made the All-Star team. He's the offensive leader, of course, for that Cavaliers squad. Certainly Jared Allen, who, made an All-Star game last year and has been the rock for the Cavaliers defensively, especially with Evan Mobley out. I mean, it's not a surprise at all to see Donovan there. It's almost, a matter of I'm a bit surprised that the Cavaliers only had one All-Star, just given how spectacular they've been since the start of the season. Of course, when you talk about, having a guy who's quote-unquote a snub for a team, you have to sort of talk about, okay, who would he replace on this squad? And that's a very difficult conversation always, but it's a especially difficult conversation just given how loaded the All-Star rosters are in both conferences this season. But with Donovan Mitchell, I mean, he's been the offensive leader for this Cavaliers squad that, again, has been just truly spectacular since the start of the new year. And, I mean, they're making a charge at potentially being a title contender at this point, especially given that even though the Celtics have been ridiculously good, the Cavaliers have been the best team in the NBA since the start of January, and Donovan Mitchell, of course, has been a huge part of that.
You're absolutely right about that, Nick. I mean, as far as Cleveland is concerned, they've been swept under the rug this year. They've done everything quietly but efficiently. I mean, they're so good on the defensive side and on the rebounding side with Jarrett Allen, and, of course, you mentioned with Darius Garland. But Donovan Mitchell is really the spark of that team, and he gives them that offensive firepower, as you stated. They've got a chance to challenge Boston. It could possibly be an Eastern Conference Finals matchup unless the Knicks or the 76ers or even Milwaukee may have something to say about that. But in the meantime, Donovan Mitchell is selected to another All-Star team. We got to get to the forwards now. Jaylen Brown from the Boston Celtics. This is going to be his third All-Star selection. Jaylen has been quiet, has been making a quiet presence. He's an MVP candidate this year. He had a solid first half of the year. His teammate Jason Tatum, we know what he's all about, but Jaylen was rewarded in this past offseason with a massive contract extension, and so far so good. He's lived up to it. This is his third All-Star selection. Your thoughts on Jaylen?
I mean, Jason Tatum is sort of the first name that people think of when they think of the Boston Celtics, but, for me, it's always been the tandem of the two of them, and it's been one of the most successful experiments of the last 5 years of the NBA, and one that a lot of other teams have started to build around and learn from, in that, having two superstar wings who can do everything on both ends of the floor is a way to turn your team into something that's pretty much impossible to guard when you have, 2 6'7", 6'8" guys like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, running the show, cutting in off the wing, spotting up from three-point range, getting out in transition. It's spectacular what the two of them can do together. And, Jaylen Brown maybe doesn't get quite as many accolades as he should for, being the clear number 2 guy, but a huge part of unlocking the number 1 guy in Jason Tatum, in that, you only have one best wing defender on your team, and, even if you have 2 spectacular wing defenders, someone's going to have a mismatch between Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and Jaylen Brown has done a great job of exploiting those mismatches all season. He's continued to make massive strides as a playmaker. I mean, he's someone who struggled mightily with his handle his first couple of years in the NBA, and the growth he's undergone since then has been nothing short of spectacular to watch. I mean, he's someone who deservingly was on Most Improved Player ballots twice during his career, because he made such a huge leap from his rookie year to his sophomore year, and then another gigantic leap from year 3 to year 4, and then year 5, of course, was his first All-Star appearance. I mean, Jaylen Brown is someone who has just beaten every sort of developmental expectation of someone who had the weaknesses he did in his college game, and he's someone who's made himself into one of the best players in the NBA, and someone who, when you combine him with someone like Jason Tatum on the wing, it's pretty much impossible to stop. And it's a reason that the Celtics have been, near the top of the Eastern Conference for quite a while now. And it's a reason that you see other teams, like most notably the Los Angeles Clippers, trying to go with these sort of 2 wing superstar models that people used to think wouldn't work when you had 2 guys filling sort of similar roles on a team. And the Boston Celtics have proven that to be untrue beyond a shadow of doubt.
You're absolutely right about that, Nick. Boston has been able to prove everyone wrong with making it work with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And as Jaylen makes another All-Star team, And let's stay with the forwards for a moment. Paolo Banchero, you talk about one of the rising stars in the NBA, last year's NBA Rookie of the Year representing the Orlando Magic, makes his first All-Star team. Orlando has been a quiet surprise in the first half of the year. A lot of young talent on that team, and it's being represented by Paolo. Give me your thoughts on him making his first All-Star team.
It's not surprising. I mean, he's been absolutely spectacular for the Magic once again this season. Again, he just sort of hit the floor running with his rookie year. I mean, it's rare in this day and age in the NBA to see someone, average 20 points a game as a rookie, and Paulo did that, and didn't even seem that difficult for him scoring-wise. And this year, I mean, he's taken a real step forward with his shot, which I think is a huge factor to his game, but a particularly huge factor to his game in the context of this Orlando Magic team that really, really struggles to shoot the three ball. Paulo making improvement on that front is huge for his development and huge for the team. He's also been the primary playmaker for the team basically since he joined the Orlando Magic, but he's really taken another step forward in that regard this season, not just being able to use his incredible bully ball game and, mid-range efficiency to put the ball in the bucket himself, but also, he's always been someone who's done a good job of getting his teammates involved, but him taking another step forward on that front this season is huge, especially given that the Magic have quite a few sort of point guard sized players, but, not necessarily someone who is quote-unquote a traditional point guard other than Markelle Fultz, who's missed the vast majority of the season for them with injury. I mean, Paolo Banchero has been a huge rock for this Orlando Magic squad, and, they've struggled a bit since the start of the new year, but this is still a Magic team that is a clear play-in contender, and, I mean, given how long this team has sort of been in the NBA wilderness, Paolo Banchero really managed to turn that ship around quickly, and certainly it seems like they're on track to at least compete for their first playoff berth since the 2019-2020 season.
The best is definitely going to get better, and certainly the future is bright for Paolo Banchero making his first All-Star team. He's a member of the Orlando Magic. All right, let's stay with the forwards now. When you mentioned his name earlier, he represents the New York Knicks, Julius Randle. Unfortunately, he will not be playing in this year's All-Star game due to injury, but Julius is making his third All-Star appearance. And before the injury, him and Jalen Brunson, while you talk about a 1-2 punch in New York with the resurgence of the Knicks, Julius Randle, you talk about one of the best big men in the league that can shoot the long-range jumper, can knock down the three-pointers. Julius Randle is one of them, even though he won't be able to play due to injury. But give me your thoughts on Julius making another All-Star team.
It's interesting. I mean, Julius, particularly 2 years ago when he really struggled, lost a lot of, I think, momentum is the right word within the Knicks fandom. I mean, again, the New York fans, and I say this as someone who's born and raised there, are very passionate about their basketball, also very passionate when players don't sort of live up to the standards that Knicks fans might have for them. And Julius got a lot of flack for the 2021-22 season when he really struggled with his shot, was not at his best efficiency-wise, and the Knicks sort of struggled in tandem with that. He's right. He righted the ship last year, made an All-NBA team, made an All-Star appearance, and has sort of continued down that road this year. The two-man game between him and Jalen Brunson is always a joy to watch. And, again, as you mentioned, this Knicks squad is really transformed by Jalen Brunson, but a lot of credit has to go to Julius Randle, who was sort of, the first pillar of the new version of the New York Knicks. And, they became, more of a contender, with Jalen Brunson running the show. But you have to remember that Julius Randle was the guy who was there first. And the 2020-2021 New York Knicks team that made the playoffs, Julius Randle was the alpha and the omega for that team. And it seemed like Knicks fans, got annoyed with sort of the holes in his game relatively quickly once he had a down season the year after that. But the two-man game between him and Jalen Brunson is spectacular. And, this Knicks squad is one that, again, as you mentioned, is really among the sort of top tier in the Eastern Conference in a way that they have not been for a very, very long time. And a lot of the credit for that deservedly goes to Jalen Brunson, but Knicks fans should take care to remember that Julius Randle was really the guy that brought the team back from, the sort of mire at the bottom of the standings that they were in for a very, very long time. And Jalen Brunson might have kicked it into another gear, but you have to remember that Julius Randle was the guy who was the pillar there first.
You're absolutely right. And as we talk about the resurgence of the New York Knicks, it's always fun when you have Los Angeles winning, but when New York is winning, it's another element when you have New York and L.A. doing very well, and especially when you have not only New York and L.A. and several other big markets, but when you have small market teams as well. The NBA is just a great parody. It makes for a great league, and it's nice to see the resurgence of the Knicks and Julius Randle doing his thing. He won't be able to play due to injury, but he's selected to another all-star team. Let's talk about our center now, Bam Adebayo, representing the Miami Heat. This is his third all-star appearance. We know Bam for basically doing the dirty work for Miami, getting the points in the paint, defense, rebounding. That's what you get out of Bam, and he's been one of the shining stars on the defensive and the rebounding side in the league. Your thoughts on Bam making another all-star team?
This has been a very odd season for the Miami Heat, but the one real constant that they've had through all the sort of weirdness of this season has been Bam Adebayo in the middle. And, I mean, you mentioned it, he does all the dirty work for this Heat team. He's, a 20-10 guy, but also someone who does a huge share of the playmaking for this Heat squad. I mean, running actions with Bam Adebayo at the top of the key, sort of high-low actions, Bam passing out of the post. He's someone who is a huge cog in keeping the Heat offense running. And, again, it's the kind of thing where given just how much of the dirty work he does on both ends of the floor, you almost don't expect him to be a 20-point-a-game scorer, but he can get his, around the basket as well. And, again, this has been a very odd sort of up-and-down season for the Miami Heat. They've really had two sort of constants, one of whom I know we're going to talk about in another section later, but Bam Adebayo has been the rock for this Heat team for quite a while now, and he's once again been that this season. They've been a team that has forged their identity on the defensive end of the floor for a long time now, and Bam Adebayo is the leader of that Miami Heat defense. So not a surprise at all to see him in another All-Star game. Very well-deserved selection from Bam Adebayo.
Absolutely, and Bam was definitely a force falling short in last year's NBA Finals to the Denver Nuggets, but Bam has definitely made his presence felt in the first half of the year as he makes another all-star team. All right, let's get to the guards, back to our guards now, and Trae Young, a.k.a. Ice Trae. I mean, what can you say about Trae, one of the top shooters in the league representing the Atlanta Hawks? This is his third all-star appearance, and again, he's replacing Joel Embiid in this year's all-star game. Give me your thoughts on Trae making another all-star team.
It's funny because the Trae Young situation is, despite the fact that they couldn't be more different as players, it's actually very similar in my mind to the Bam Adebayo situation. There's more talent around Bam in Miami, certainly, but Trae Young has been the rock for this Hawk squad that's had a lot of chaos this season. And, again, he's someone who he struggled a bit to start the year, and I think a lot of people clung to that after he started to heat up following that cold sort of October-November stretch. But, I mean, one of the most spectacular playmakers in basketball, his ability to sling the ball all over the court, not just make the right reads and make good passes, but make the sort of highlight reel plays that only a handful of guys in the NBA can make at all. And, Trae is also obviously famous for his, ridiculously long-range three-point attempts, being willing to pull up from the parking lot, but he's someone who is just an offensive force unto himself, and it was a bit surprising that he wasn't selected before the injury replacements came along, but he was clearly going to be one of the injury replacements once it got down to that point in the sort of situation with the All-Star rosters, and, very well-deserved selection for a team that is currently in a play-in spot, and without Trae Young would be very near the top of the lottery given just how much chaos there is on the rest of the roster. Trae Young has done a spectacular job to hold it together to the degree that he has. I mean, again, this is a situation that without Trae Young, they might be, competing with the Detroits and Washingtons and Charlottes and San Antonios of the world for teams at the bottom of the NBA standings. Instead, they're still clinging to a play-in contention spot almost exclusively due to Trae Young's spectacular play this year.
Rightfully so, and as you said, Trae has been one of the few bright spots on the Atlanta Hawks team. So Trae Young makes another All-Star team. And then finally, we have our forward, Scotty Barnes, representing the Toronto Raptors, making his first All-Star team. Scotty is one of the rising stars in the league for a team that went through some growing pains the last couple of years, as recent as them trading one of their great talent, Pascal Siakam, to the Indiana Pacers. So Toronto, the last couple of years, they've gone through growing pains, trading their top players with losing Fred VanVleet to free agency. He's with the Houston Rockets. And then with Siakam being traded to the Indiana Pacers, Marc Gasol retires. So this is a team that's definitely been in transition the last couple of years. But Scotty Barnes, one of the few consistent players for the Raptors. Give me your thoughts on Scotty making the team. He's replacing Julius Randle.
Scotty Barnes is someone who is living proof of one of the biggest adages of NBA draft coverage, which is development isn't linear. And Scotty Barnes, in a way had a sort of come from behind Rookie of the Year award victory when, Evan Mobley was sort of the lead guy in the Rookie of the Year clubhouse for the vast majority of the season until Scotty Barnes had a red hot March and April. And then his sophomore season in the NBA, he essentially just did everything he did his rookie year except slightly worse. I mean, his assist numbers took a step forward, but, really other than just pure assist numbers, he, had appeared to sort of be stuck in place after his, Rookie of the Year award victory. And this year, year three, he has taken a massive step forward, which, is encouraging for any young player, obviously, but particularly encouraging given that he hadn't quite appeared to make a dramatic step forward in year two. And, that's why it's important to emphasize that development isn't linear. I mean, his three-point shooting has been a revelation this year. He's put up 5 3-point attempts a game and hit 35% of them. And that's, after a pretty tough couple of games recently when it comes to his three-point shooting. I mean, he was closer to the 37% mark for much of the year. And him going from being essentially a non-shooter to being average from three-point range has done so much to unlock the rest of his game. Of course, he's taken on the primary playmaking responsibilities with Kyle Lowry no longer in the picture and now has an even larger role in this Toronto roster with OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam both being traded. It's pretty clear that this Toronto Raptors team has, after a long time of sort of hanging on, has finally decided to sort of go all in on the rebuild. And clearly the shining star of that rebuild is going to be Scotty Barnes. I mean, only 22 years old, making an All-Star game in his third season in the NBA and taking such a huge step forward after essentially seeming like he was stuck in place last year. It's proof that development isn't linear, but also it's proof that, Scotty Barnes has put in the work to, be someone who didn't just sort of, win Rookie of the Year and sit on his laurels. He's made huge strides forward in his game this year, and it's been a lost year for the Toronto Raptors, and certainly it seems like they're going to be in a rebuilding phase for at least the next couple of years, but they do have the rock, they do have the anchor of that rebuild, and that is Scotty Barnes, and he'll continue to improve certainly for years to come.
Rightfully so, Toronto's getting younger, and you're right, Nick, they're going to continue to rebuild, and certainly Scotty Barnes is really at the helm and is going to be the anchor of that team as he's selected to his first All-Star team. And we have our head coach of the Eastern Conference representing the Milwaukee Bucks, Doc Rivers. What an interesting year it's been for him. So he becomes one of the play-by-play announcers for a popular network for their NBA coverage. Let's just say that he was there long enough to get a cup of coffee and a pastry, and then all of a sudden the whole Adrian Griffin situation comes about, which is very strange to me, so to speak. So Adrian's let go, and now Doc becomes the head coach of the Bucks. Your thoughts on Doc becoming the head coach of the Eastern Conference?
It is a fascinating quirk of the way that the head coach of the All-Star Game works. I mean, it going to the coach of the leading team in the conference, but then sort of being passed down the line if that guy was the coach last year. Obviously Joe Mazzulla is not repeating as the coach of the Eastern Conference at the All-Star Game. And so instead, the coach of the Eastern Conference at the All-Star Game is someone who's been there quite a few times before in Doc Rivers, but also someone who has gone 3-7 during his coaching tenure with the Milwaukee Bucks after, the guy that he replaced went 30-13 in his first year as a coach, and the interim in between that, Joe Prunty, won 2 of his 3 games. It's been an odd situation in Milwaukee, honestly, all year. I mean, since the sort of rumblings in the preseason and the Terry Stotts abruptly leaving the team after being the associate head coach, it's been a weird sort of rocky up and down year in Milwaukee, and a very strange situation for Doc Rivers to, as you mentioned, spend a few months announcing and then sort of be dragged into the Milwaukee Bucks situation and not exactly righting the ship to start off his coaching tenure in Milwaukee, but certainly someone who's been a head coach in the NBA for a long time, not someone who's a stranger to the All-Star Game sidelines, either, as a player or as a coach, right? But it's odd for him to sort of walk into this Bucks situation, struggle out of the gate, and then immediately be the Eastern Conference All-Star coach. But that is, one of the more fascinating quirks I've seen of the way that the All-Star Game coach is selected.
All right, so it's official. So Doc Rivers is the head coach of the Eastern Conference. He represents the Milwaukee Bucks, and that's our Eastern Conference All-Stars. Now let's get to the Western Conference All-Stars. And the East, talented roster, especially the starters. But, man, the starters on the Western Conference, hey, this is phenomenal. Let's start off with our guards. Luka Doncic representing the Dallas Mavericks. This is going to be his 5th All-Star game. And what can you say about Luka just entering his prime powers right now, one of the best offensive players in the NBA, again, a part of the wave and a part of the explosion of the international players. He represents Slovenia. Give me your thoughts on Luka making another All-Star team.
Once again, it's not a surprise. I mean, Luka Doncic established himself in the NBA almost immediately and has been an All-Star mainstay since year 2 in the NBA after winning Rookie of the Year in year 1. And, I mentioned with Paulo how rare it is to average 20 points a game as a rookie. Well, Luka Doncic did that in his Rookie of the Year award-winning rookie season. And, since then, he's been an MVP candidate. He's made All-NBA first team each of the last 4 seasons, seems on track to do that again. I mean, with Joel Embiid not playing enough games with his 35-point-a-game average, it seems like a given at this point that Luka Doncic is going to end the season as the NBA scoring leader, which, given everything he does as a playmaker, is truly astounding. I mean, the fact that, again, this is year 2 of him being a 30-point-a-game scorer. He's taken a huge step forward in terms of his three-point efficiency. Him getting to 38% from three-point range while also upping his volume from three-point range. I mean, it's something that, that was really the one weakness of his game earlier on in his career, that and, he wasn't a spectacular free throw shooter, but, this is offensive weaknesses. I mean, defense is another story, but, I think he doesn't get quite as much credit as he should on the defensive end, but going back to the offensive end, I mean, one of the most spectacular playmaker scorers we've ever seen in the NBA, and, him being on track to be the league's leading scorer while also having an outside chance at averaging 10 assists per game, it's truly incredible. And, he's someone who, since day 1 in the league has made his teammates better, and not surprised at all to see him starting another All-Star game, and certainly someone who's clearly one of the future stars of the NBA, and doesn't even need to be a future star because he's been one of the stars of the NBA for quite a while now.
Absolutely, and the best is indeed going to get better as Luka Doncic makes another All-Star team. Our other guard now, this gentleman represents being one of the rising stars in the NBA, and again, another crop of talent coming from north of the border in Canada. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander representing the young and very vibrant Oklahoma City Thunder. This is his 2nd All-Star appearance. Give me your thoughts on Shai making another All-Star team.
So my Kings Weekly co-host, Ray LeBeau, likes to refer to the Oklahoma City Thunder situation going into any given game as pretty simple in that we have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and you don't. He's someone who is virtually impossible to guard. I mean, his slithery handle, his ability to sort of snake his way through small spaces, his ability to take advantage of every single momentary lapse in the defense. He's absolutely spectacular as a finisher around the basket, and it's always a mistake to foul him because he's averaging, he's shooting 88% from the free throw line. But, teams have to foul him because otherwise he's going to get to the rim and score every time. And, him knocking down his free throws at a ridiculous rate while averaging 9 of them a game is something to behold. He's also taken a massive step forward on the defensive end, the last couple years, but really this year has been, huge for him on that end. I mean, he's currently leading the NBA in steals per game, which is not something that, I would have expected based on either his college numbers or his early season numbers, but, he's someone who's really made a point of getting into passing lanes more this season, of ripping the ball from guys when he's, on ball. And again, I mean, he's someone who, from year one with the LA Clippers, it was pretty clear that he was going to be a star eventually, but man, I mean, as soon as he got to OKC, he hit the ground running. And this year 2 of him being a 30-point-a-game scorer, just absolutely unstoppable. And, this Thunder team, they had a bit of a breakout last year, but really this has been the year. And, it kind of seemed like it would be anyway, just given that Chet Holmgren missed all of last season with his Lisfranc injury. But, with Chet in the fold, with Jalen Williams taking another step forward, with Cason Wallace added to the team as someone who's been an incredibly important rotational player for them, this Thunder team is taking a massive leap forward to being one of the contenders in the Western Conference. But all of that starts with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's been, the shining star for this Thunder team basically since he was traded there. But now that he's got a bit more of a star-studded cast around him, this Thunder team once again looks to be one of the, top teams in the NBA. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is the start of all of that.
You're absolutely right, and he is perfect for that Thunder team. Very young, a team that's on the rise, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a rising star as he represents the Oklahoma City Thunder, making his second All-Star team. Let's go to the forwards now, and a future Hall of Famer representing the Phoenix Suns, Kevin Durant. This is his 14th All-Star appearance. You talk about someone that's been one of the best scorers in the NBA, someone who's been an efficient defender, and somebody just continues to play at a high level. Kevin Durant, your thoughts on KD making another All-Star team?
So the Suns have not been as truly absurd as the Cleveland Cavaliers since the start of 2024, but they're essentially next on the list. I mean, on the morning of January 1st, this team was 17-15, and now they're 33-22. They've cemented themselves in one of the, non-play-in spots, currently sitting at 6th in the Western Conference. And they're a team that, Bradley Beal missed a ton of time with injury. They took a lot of time to gel early in the season, but Kevin Durant has, as he has been for many of the teams that he's been on throughout his NBA career, he's been the rock for this Sun squad. And, this is a team that doesn't really have a traditional point guard. They've had Devin Booker sort of running the point just, out of need to have somebody there. But Kevin Durant's playmaking is, I think, something that's been really under-discussed throughout his NBA career, and that's been a huge part of the value that he's provided to the Phoenix Suns this season. But ultimately, when you're talking about Kevin Durant, you're talking about one of the greatest scorers in the history of the NBA. He's continued to be truly absurdly efficient, 54, 44, 87 shooting splits. It's unheard of, especially for someone averaging 28 points a game. And, again, with Kevin Durant, he's someone who, at age 35, it's one of those things where you have to wonder how much longer he's going to be at this level. But, as we've seen from him and as we've seen from LeBron, when you're a, wing/forward with that kind of size who can, score in so many different ways, the aging curve for you is a lot slower than it is for some of the other players in the league. And, injury is always a factor, of course. And, KD is someone who's actually come back from multiple injuries and still been, at or near the top of the NBA game. So hopefully we continue to see this version of Kevin Durant for a long time to come. I mean, NBA history would tell us that, maybe he's only got a few more in him, but the last few years of NBA history tells us that, some of the elite of the elite can really hang around at the top tier of the NBA for a long time, and Kevin Durant has already proven that, and hopefully he'll continue to prove that for years to come.
I hope so, too. KD's been one of the best players in the NBA, and he just continues to, continue to play at a high level. And speaking of continuing to play at a high level, it is 20th All-Star selection at the forward position, LeBron James from the Los Angeles Lakers. We talked about Kevin Durant continue to play at a high level. But LeBron, year in and year out, just continues to deliver, representing the Los Angeles Lakers. Again, this is his 20th All-Star selection. Your thoughts on LeBron?
It's getting difficult to find anything to say about LeBron that hasn't been said before, but, I'll do my best here. I mean, again, in contention for the best player of all time, certainly in anybody's top three when you talk about the best players in the history of the NBA. He broke Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's scoring record last season. He's about 300 points away from passing Hall of Famer Oscar Schmidt of Brazil for most points scored by any professional in any context, and Oscar Schmidt played professionally from 18 to 45. So, LeBron's got a few years to go in terms of matching Oscar Schmidt's longevity and, actual playing time on the court, but every scoring record that you can possibly think of, LeBron James has at this point, and, he's also someone who, already has 10,000 assists, 10,000 rebounds. He's broken so many records at this point, and, people have been wondering when the end of LeBron James as one of the best players in the NBA would be, basically, since his second stint in Cleveland. It's been, and even before that, honestly, is like, when is LeBron James going to stop being LeBron James? When is LeBron James going to stop being LeBron James? And the answer continues to be not yet. Got to keep waiting for it. And, it's funny because this year is his lowest points per game average since his rookie year. He's still averaging 25 points a game, just under 8 assists, just over 7 rebounds a game. He's shooting his best three-point percentage since his, third year in Miami. He's close to eclipsing 40% from three-point range for the second time in his career, continuing to evolve his game as he goes along. I mean, he's someone who, early on in his career, one of the knocks against him was that he just relied on his athleticism so much. Then he developed such a spectacular post game in Miami, and, now he's continued to work on his jump shot to the point where that's, a real weapon for him as well. It's hard to say things about LeBron James that haven't been said, many, 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 many times before. But as long as he continues to be one of the best players in the NBA and continues to cement his case for best player of all time, again, even if you don't think of him as the best player of all time, he's certainly someone who you have to think about at or near the top of your list. And him continuing to be just as dominant as he's been for yet another season, it's a joy to watch. And it's one of those questions that makes you think, man, Father Time would tell us that at some point LeBron James has to stop being LeBron James, but hard to find any evidence of it yet.
You're right about that, and I always say the best continues to get better. Well, the best continues to get better. We definitely have to enjoy a master at work in LeBron James because we don't know how many years we're going to have this, but he continues to push the envelope, and I don't think LeBron is done anytime soon by any stretch of the imagination. And so this is his 20th All-Star selection, LeBron James representing the Los Angeles Lakers. And at the center position, representing the Denver Nuggets, Nikola Jokic, last year's NBA Finals MVP with the Denver Nuggets, also a two-time league MVP. This is his 6th All-Star selection. The Joker doing what he does best, right? I mean, again, another crop, just a wave of talent, the international players representing Serbia. Your thoughts on Nikola making another All-Star team?
Again, not a surprising selection at all. I mean, Nikola Jokic has been, honestly the best player in basketball over the last, really 3.5 seasons. And, granted, he fell just short of winning his 3rd consecutive regular season MVP last year, but I think he's perfectly happy with that finals MVP instead. I mean, he's someone who has been, he's one of the best passers we've ever seen at any position. Certainly, I think at this point he's cemented himself pretty much indisputably as the best passing big man we've ever seen. And, I mean, he just continues to turn the game on its head, and he just continues to be someone who's remarkably impossible to guard, given his sort of physical attributes, but his ability to play the game at a speed that nobody else can find a way to match, his ability to throw guys off his rhythm, his ability to create something out of nothing, whether that is, for his own offense or creating something out of nothing for his teammates. Again, he's just so much fun to watch. He's been one of, if not the best players in the NBA for the past, 4 seasons now. And him being an all-star starter yet again is not a surprise. I fully expect him to be in the running for MVP at the end of the season. He might even be a leader in the clubhouse at this point, although certainly, Jason Tatum should get some credit in that race. And, of course, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Luka Doncic, too, who we've already talked about. But, the idea with Nikola Jokic is just that he's someone who makes the game look different for everybody around him. And almost always when that happens, it's him creating an advantage for his team that you wouldn't expect. I mean, he's also, really taken huge steps forward as a defender since early on in his career. He's never going to be an all-defensive team guy, but his ability to, play the passing lanes incredibly well, to use the strengths that he does have on defense, namely his massive size, to at least be a deterrent around the basket. He's, again, one of the best players in the NBA. Very unsurprising that he's made yet another All-Star appearance, and certainly he'll be one of the top candidates for what would be his 3rd MVP award at the end of this season.
Nikola Jokic, man, what a player that he is. He represents the Denver Nuggets, making his 6th All-Star team. All right, let's move over now to the reserves. And with the guards, Devin Booker representing the Phoenix Suns. This is his 4th All-Star appearance. Him and KD, they're a great combination so far. Devin, one of the best shooters in the league, doing what he does best. And again, just a typical Devin Booker type year, racking up points, 3-point percentage, field goal percentage, everything you would ask out of him. Your thoughts on Devin making another All-Star team?
Yeah, I mean, Devin being one of the best shooters in the league has been something that's been the case for a long time, but something that I've talked about quite a bit, mostly with Tyler Metcalf over at No Ceilings, but with basically everybody on the No Ceilings staff on the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dive podcast, little mid-episode plug for you there. But with Devin Booker, he's someone who has really shown just how much you can do with player development. And of course, the vast majority of the credit for that has to go to Devin Booker for the work that he's done on his own game. But, he came into the league as someone who was very clearly a pure shooting guard. Someone who, okay, he can move the ball around if the situation calls for it. But, on a whole host of terrible Phoenix Suns teams, he got sort of dismissed as, he's just putting up points on a bad team, But, that's one thing. His ridiculous scoring ability from day one, a lot of that got discredited due to, okay, somebody has to take the shot on this terrible Suns team. But what he didn't get enough credit for, and what I think is the most impressive part of Devin Booker's development is, again, he went from a mostly off-ball scorer type of player to someone who could do a lot with the ball in his hands as a playmaker. And, I mean, the fact that he's been the starting point guard, essentially, for the Phoenix Suns all year this year is a testament to the incredible amount of work that he's put in over the course of his now 9-year NBA career. And, him going from, again, being an off-ball scorer type to slowly over the course of the first, 4 or 5 years of his career, morphing into someone you'd trust as a playmaker with the ball in his hands. It was huge for the Phoenix Suns at the time that he was undergoing that development, but, now with the roster situation that they find themselves in this season, he's been able to comfortably step into the point guard role in a way that would have been almost impossible to imagine, when he was starting out his NBA career.
Indeed, he is a pure shooting guard, Nick, and he earns another All-Star selection, Devin Booker from the Phoenix Suns. Let's stay with the guards, and we talked about LeBron James being a master at work. Stephen Curry from the Golden State Warriors, he's been selected to his 10th All-Star team. And what can you say about him, right? What can you say about Steph? A lot of people say the greatest shooter of all time. We've seen a lot of great shooters throughout the course of the NBA, but, man, Steph has just elevated it to another level, still getting it done, still playing at such a high level. I don't think he's going to hang it up anytime soon. Your thoughts on Steph making another All-Star team?
No, he's definitely not going to be hanging it up anytime soon. And it's funny in that, there are two teams that are in such different sort of situations and, viewpoints from the sort of general NBA perspective. But this Golden State Warriors season is very similar to the Atlanta Hawks season. They're also 10th, 10th in the West as opposed to 10th in the East. much better record, just, given sort of where the wins and losses are concentrated in the Western Conference. But, again, they're a team that's on the fringe of being out of the play-in, and without Steph Curry being truly spectacular this season, they're, probably one of the bottom lottery teams. And, 28 points a game, 46, 42, 92 shooting splits. I mean, you mentioned him being, having an argument for best shooter in NBA history. For me, that's a pretty open and shut case, honestly. I think it's very clearly Steph Curry. I mean, 91% free throw shooting for his career, NBA best free throw shooter. Obviously, he holds the record for most three-pointers made, and, he's knocked them down at a 43% clip over the course of his career. Of course, I talked earlier about Trae Young and his parking lot range. Well, Steph Curry was really the first guy who sort of revolutionized the NBA in terms of just pulling up from 30-plus feet if he was left open, and, it forced teams to completely change how defenses played, honestly, just in terms of, having to pick Steph Curry up at half court. It's not something that you would see if you look at the NBA 15 years ago, and it's a testament to just how much Steph Curry has transformed the league. So, once again, very deserved All-Star selection for him, and he's been keeping the Golden State Warriors afloat this year, and, hopefully they continue to at least stay in play-in contention because, certainly as their rival up north, it's, fun as a Sacramento Kings fan to have the Warriors be, good, but maybe not better than the Sacramento Kings, but Steph keeping this team afloat has been really the story of the Golden State Warriors season. And again, very much deserved All-Star selection. Certainly don't expect him to, be out of the All-Star race anytime soon, but just continuing to push his lead forward in terms of, the three-point shooting brilliance that he's put on over the course of his career.
I want to stay just talking about Steph for a moment before we go to the other All-Star reserves. We know about the rivalry between Stephen Curry and LeBron James. There was recent news that there was the rumor mill about LeBron possibly being dealt at the trade deadline, going to Golden State. Draymond Green and LeBron, they both are represented by Rich Paul at Clutch Sports. Draymond tried to make it happen, but LeBron and Jeannie Buss and the Lakers said nothing was going to happen. LeBron didn't want, LeBron was committed to being a Laker. Can you tell me how close we were to having possibly seen LeBron and Steph being teammates in Golden State?
Oh, man, that would have been truly something. And, certainly a situation where both the Warriors and the Lakers are, not quite where they want to be right now. And, who knows what a blockbuster like that might have looked like. My sort of sense of it is that this was a long shot sort of deal to figure out, but the fact that this deal was even under discussion, under consideration at all, I think says a lot, first of all, about where both teams are, but, secondly, just, man, the two of them, the two Akron's finest, right? Steph Curry and LeBron James, both born in Akron, Ohio, but, the idea with a Steph Curry, LeBron James-led team is, pretty much unstoppable no matter who they have around them. It would have been interesting to sort of figure out who the Golden State Warriors trade pieces would have been. Presumably it would have been, some combination of their young guys. Jonathan Kuminga's had a really strong season. Brandon Podziemski has been a very impressive rookie for them. Probably some combination of the two of them, maybe Moses Moody as well, who's, had really strong moments for the Warriors this season despite being in and out of their rotation. It would have been interesting to try and put a deal together. I'm not quite sure how close it was to the finish line, but certainly, in terms of NBA hypotheticals, it's hard to think of a more fascinating situation than, LeBron James and Steph Curry and what people think might be the twilight of their careers, teaming up and taking on all comers. It would have been a fascinating situation to watch.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting, but I'm actually kind of glad it didn't happen. I think I currently like the rivalry between LeBron and Steph. It's been fun watching those two go up against one another. But, hey, it could have happened, but it didn't happen. But nevertheless, Steph Curry makes another All-Star team. If this is his 10th All-Star selection, he represents the Golden State Warriors. We have our other guard representing the Minnesota Timberwolves, Anthony Edwards. This is his second All-Star appearance. We talk about the rising stars in the NBA. Anthony Edwards is one of them, and he has been a mainstay, a consistent force for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Your thoughts on Anthony making another All-Star team?
It's not surprising at all that he made yet another All-Star team. Really, the only surprising part, I think, has been that this Timberwolves squad has been the leader in the Western Conference all season. And, you know, certainly it seemed like last season there were a bit of growing pains with, you know, integrating Rudy Gobert into the lineup after that massive trade. But, I mean, in terms of the leader of this squad, Anthony Edwards came in and imposed himself as a force almost immediately. I mean, almost won Rookie of the Year award, of course, but, you know, since then he's made All-Star game each of his last 2 seasons, you know, 26 points a game this season. He's taken huge steps forward on the defensive end as well, which is huge for a Timberwolves team that has built their identity on being the best defensive team in the NBA. And again, I don't think anybody would have expected the Minnesota Timberwolves to be the #1 team in the Western Conference at this point in the season, but you know, a huge part of that is due to Anthony Edwards, you know, coming in and being a star, A1 from day one, as he himself puts it in basically any interview you have with him, you know, but he's someone who's, you know, clearly incredibly charismatic, a clear, important leader for this Minnesota Timberwolves team, and definitely one of the faces of the NBA, you know, not even future faces. You know, this Timberwolves team has cemented themselves as the best team in the Western Conference at this point in the All-Star break, and Anthony Edwards is the face of that team. So, you know, despite him, you know, only being in year 3, despite him being 22 years old, he's already one of the faces of the NBA. And I think it's a matter of when, not if, he earns a slot in the starting lineup as opposed to just coming off the bench for the All-Star game.
You're absolutely right about Anthony, and he is indeed a charismatic presence and definitely the star and the leader of the Minnesota Timberwolves, Anthony Edwards, making his second All-Star team. We have our forwards now. Paul George from the Los Angeles Clippers making his 9th All-Star team. This is kind of like a homecoming for George. He began his career with the Indiana Pacers, had some really good seasons with them, then had the injury and then was dealt to OKC before heading back west to the LA Clippers. But what a first half of the year it's been for the Clippers. The Clippers have been a dark horse for a long time, but Paul George, always consistent. He makes another All-Star team. Your thoughts on Paul making another All-Star team?
Yeah, I mean, he's been a rock for this Clippers squad for quite a while now. It is very interesting that he's going back to Indiana for this All-Star game. He had some really insightful comments actually recently about, you know, sort of the situation in Indiana and, you know, why he doesn't expect his number to be retired there, just given how all of the Pacers' retired numbers are guys who stuck with a franchise either for the entirety of their careers or the vast majority of it. And Paul George didn't quite have that longevity with the team. But, I mean, if you talk about peak performance, you know, Paul George at the peak of his powers for the Pacers was one of the best players the Pacers have ever had. And that's a very storied franchise with a long history. But, I mean, we've talked about it before of, you know, the incredible sight to watch of a young Paul George, you know, taking on LeBron James for the, you know, crown of the Eastern Conference. And, you know, Paul never quite managed to dethrone LeBron James, but for a long while, he was really the only guy standing in LeBron's way. And, you know, he's someone who has continued to, you know, stick around in the NBA as one of the stars, you know, not quite the #1 guy like he was for Indiana earlier in his career, but, I mean, you know, his stop with OKC, you know, made a couple All-Star games, you know, made an All-NBA first team, you know, contended for MVP one of those years, you know, coming to LA, coming, you know, back home. I mean, he's from Palmdale, which is a couple hours up the road from where the Clippers play. You know, he's someone who has been one of the best forwards in the league for a long time. And, you know, really the story with the Clippers this season has been that they've been healthy. I mean, you know, Paul George, you know, he missed a few games with injury, but he's played 50 of the 53 games for the Clippers. I mean, Kawhi Leonard itself is always a bit more of a struggle, and we'll certainly get to Kawhi in a minute. But, you know, the two of them with James Harden, they've been, you know, spectacular since some early season sort of growing pains with getting Harden, you know, integrated into the lineup. Since November 14th, this team is 33-10, and, you know, Paul George has been a spectacular second star for a while now, and, you know, him sort of being #2/3 with James Harden makes this Clippers team incredibly dangerous. And, you know, the Clippers as a whole, really their struggle for the last few seasons has been just, can they stay healthy? Because when they're fully healthy, they are an absolute force, as you mentioned. And, fingers crossed that it continues to stay that way, because especially given that, Paul George, James Harden, and Kawhi Leonard are, all over 30 at this point, it'll be interesting to see how long the window stays open for the Clippers, but this might be the best chance they have, and certainly Paul George being as consistent of a rock as he's been all season long has been a huge part of why the season has been such a roaring success for the Clippers so far.
Absolutely. In PG-13, Paul George makes another all-star team representing the Los Angeles Clippers. And let's stay with the Clippers at the other forward position. His teammate, Kawhi Leonard, representing the Los Angeles Clippers, makes his sixth all-star team. And Kawhi, what can you say about him? He says he's a fun guy, and he's proven to be a fun guy during this first half of the year, teaming up with PG-13. And Kawhi is, when he's healthy, he's one of the best, and certainly he's proven that during the first half of the year. Your thoughts on Kawhi making another all-star team?
Yeah, essentially with Kawhi Leonard, when he's healthy, he's going to make an all-star team. He's going to compete for all-NBA honors. He's, going to be one of the, candidates for an all-defensive team. He's not quite the defensive player of the year at this point in his career as he was in San Antonio, but, all of the story of Kawhi Leonard is just, can he stay healthy? Because when he's healthy, he's pretty much indisputably one of the 10 best players in the league. And, him being the force that he's been for the Clippers this season, it's been, wonderful to watch. And this has been the healthiest season that he's had in a while. And I hate saying that out loud because it almost feels like I'm jinxing him in a way, but he's been very healthy this season, and that's been a huge part of why the Clippers are one of the top teams in the Western Conference. And, with Kawhi, just absolutely devastating in the mid-range, just can get to his shot whenever he wants it, can pull up and hit it over pretty much any defender. The three-point threat, as he's been since, the very beginning of his NBA career, his development of his shooting stroke was one of the most fascinating developmental stories I've ever seen, going from someone who was essentially a non-shooter entirely at San Diego State to being one of the most lethal three-point shooters in the NBA. And this season, just, ridiculous, 45% from three-point range on the 5 attempts per game, continuing to, be a huge part of the defensive game plan for the Clippers and, ceding a bit of playmaking responsibilities to James Harden, but still continuing to be someone who will always make the right decision with the ball in his hands. It's, as you mentioned, he's been incredibly fun to watch, as he always is when he's healthy. And, again, not a surprising all-star selection at all, but always happy to see Kawhi Leonard on the all-star roster, because really it just means that he's been healthy for enough of the year to be selected, because when he's playing a healthy number of games, Kawhi Leonard is always going to be one of the best players in the league.
Absolutely. It's always fun watching the Claw play when he's healthy, and Kawhi Leonard makes another all-star team representing the Los Angeles Clippers. At the other forward position, Nick, we talked about some of the best big men in the league that can shoot the long-range shot. Joel Embiid, Julius Randle, also Nikola Jokic, and we have Karl Anthony Towns representing the Minnesota Timberwolves. He makes his fourth all-star team. Give me your thoughts on Karl Anthony making another team.
Yeah, it's not surprising given that the Timberwolves are the number one team in the Western Conference, given that Karl Anthony Towns has had a really awesome season. It's interesting just because last year, again, I mentioned the growing pains that the Timberwolves had earlier when talking about Anthony Edwards, but really Karl Anthony Towns was sort of the hardest hit, I think is the best way of putting it, by the sort of change in situation necessitated by the Rudy Gobert trade. And this season, he's back to being Karl Anthony Towns. After a near-career worst mark from three-point range last season, he's back up to 44% from three-point range, 22.5 points a game, clear offensive leader for the team. But also, someone who earlier on in his career, Karl Anthony Towns struggled mightily on the defensive end. And, it was difficult to imagine him being in a context where he could be, one of the leaders on a great defensive team. And yet, here we are in year 9 for Karl Anthony Towns, and he's, one of the 2 All-Stars on a Minnesota Timberwolves team that's number 1 in the Western Conference and number 1 in the NBA defensively, in terms of defensive rating, points allowed per game. So with Karl Anthony Towns, as a Sacramento Kings fan, it's unfortunate that Domantas Sabonis didn't get the nod at center, but, when you're talking about Karl Anthony Towns, it's hard to say that he didn't deserve an All-Star selection, given the way that he's been playing this year and given just how good the Minnesota Timberwolves has been. So, again, there's sort of the Kings fan perspective that's a little bit sad that Domantas Sabonis didn't get the nod here over Karl-Anthony Towns, but it's hard to knock the selection. Cat has had a spectacular season for the Timberwolves.
It wouldn't be right if we did have any Sacramento Kings references. Shouts out to Domantas Sabonis. But at the forward position, Karl-Anthony Towns makes another all-star team representing the Minnesota Timberwolves. And then finally, at the center position for the reserves, we have Anthony Davis from the Los Angeles Lakers making his 9th all-star team. For the most part, Nick, this has been a healthy first half of the year for Anthony. Anthony had a couple of injuries, but overall, this has been one of his best seasons so far, not just in terms of health, but really stepping up his game on the defensive side. Offensively, we know he's going to get it done, no surprise. Your thoughts on Anthony making another all-star team?
Yeah, I mean, he's been an all-defensive team candidate for a while now, but, I think part of the story with Anthony Edwards is, Anthony Davis, excuse me, goodness. But, part of the story with Anthony Davis is just that, he went from being, everything for the New Orleans Pelicans teams that he was on earlier in his career to, being able to, not be the only guy, essentially, for a team. It was interesting because there was sort of the conversation around, Anthony Davis and LeBron James teaming up in Los Angeles where, Anthony Davis was sort of seen as maybe taking the torch from LeBron, and it seemed like LeBron wasn't quite ready to give up the torch just yet. But, when you talk about Anthony Davis, again, a lot of it is a story of health. I mean, he, played 36 games year 2 in LA, still made the All-Star game because most of the time he missed was after the All-Star break, but, year 3 in LA only played 40 games, and this year he's played almost every game for the Lakers, which, if he clears the 70-game threshold, which he's on track to do right now, it would be the first time since the 2017-2018 season with the New Orleans Pelicans. So, him being healthy has been a huge story. He's, continued to, struggle with his three-point shot, which is really the only hole that he has in his game at this point, but he's been a lot more judicious about taking them than he was sort of earlier on in his Lakers career, and, he's done a lot for sort of spreading out the rest of his game, as it were. I mean, again, much-deserved all-star selection. He and LeBron have been keeping this Lakers team afloat and in playoff contention all season long, and with Davis, it's a similar story to Joel Embiid and Kawhi Leonard in that when they're healthy, you expect them to be one of the top players in the NBA and a clear all-star selection. And certainly for Anthony Davis, that's been the case once again this season.
Absolutely. And Anthony Davis makes another all-star team representing the Los Angeles Lakers. And the head coach of the Western Conference is going to be Chris Finch from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Give me your thoughts on Chris being the head coach for the Western Conference.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it sort of tangentially when talking about Anthony Edwards, when talking about Karl-Anthony Towns, but this Timberwolves team being top of the Western Conference at this point in the season was certainly not anything that I think anyone anticipated before the season started. But, I mean, a lot of credit has to go to Chris Finch, who's been a real superstar of a coach the last few years. I mean, the turnaround that this Minnesota Timberwolves team has undergone, of course, a lot of that is due to drafting Anthony Edwards. A lot of that is due to the Rudy Gobert trade. But certainly last year, it seemed like the Rudy Gobert trade was, going to go down as a huge mistake for the Timberwolves. And yet, again, a huge lion's share of the credit, of course, has to go to the players for figuring all of that out. But some of the credit has to go to Chris Finch, too, for figuring out a way to manage the situation with Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns so that it played best to both of their strengths. And, it's turned into a situation where this Minnesota Timberwolves team, not just the Western Conference leader, as I mentioned, not just the best defensive team in the NBA, as I've mentioned, but a team that has two players that people thought wouldn't be able to play together, and certainly had a lot of evidence for that theory with last year's Timberwolves team. Of course, again, the lion's share of the credit has to go to the players, but Chris Finch has been able to figure out the rosters and figure out the scheme, figure out the rotation such that Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Anthony Edwards can all be at their best. And it's led to a shocking Timberwolves team at the top of the Western Conference. And certainly a team that didn't seem, as recently as last season, like they were going to be a title contender anytime soon. Here they are, top of the class in the Western Conference and one of the more dangerous teams to think about when we're looking ahead to the playoff situation.
All right, so the head coach of the Western Conference representing the Minnesota Timberwolves is Chris Finch, and we have our Western Conference All-Stars. Now, this is interesting, Nick, because this is the first year that the NBA All-Star Game will return to the Eastern Conference versus Western Conference. Previously, we had Team Giannis versus Team LeBron, or we had Team Steph versus Team LeBron, or we had kind of like those type of teams. But now we're getting back to the original Eastern Conference versus Western Conference. Do you like this format, or would you prefer the players having their own teams and doing the draft on the night of the All-Star Game?
I'm honestly torn because I think the first couple of years of the players drafting their own teams and doing it that way rather than the traditional conference format, I think we got a couple of the best All-Star games we've seen in a long time out of that situation. And, I think that there's something certainly to be said for that. But, with that being said, the last couple of years, the game has not been anywhere near as much fun as it was the first couple of years of the drafting situation. And, there were some funny moments with the draft situation. There were also some awkward moments, It's like almost bringing me back to those playground days. And, thankfully I was not the last kid picked for the teams, but, there was always a little pang in my heart when, I would be sitting there watching whoever it was that was, the last two people, potentially being picked for any sort of playground game. And, there's that sort of element to it, which had some funny moments, had some sort of awkward, weird moments. But going back to the traditional format, I mean, there's a lot to be said for it. Certainly when you are talking about, greatest all-star games of years past, a lot of it was due to sort of Eastern Conference, Western Conference rivalry. So it'll be fun to see that, sort of come back into play. I mean, again, I'm torn just because we got a couple of great all-star games out of that player drafting format. We also got a couple of, not great ones. And given, that sort of situation, I think there's a lot to be said for going back to the traditional format. And, we'll have to hope that the, sort of reinstating of the old format, does a little bit to at least sort of raise the competition level of this year's All-Star Game as opposed to the last couple of years. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I'm not particularly leaning one way or the other. I think there were some real positives to the old system, but, there's also something to be said for, sort of bringing it back to the way that All-Star Games of yore that people remember so fondly were played.
Yeah, been some great All-Star games when it was East versus West, and there have been some good games as well when the players were allowed to draft their own teams, but it's good that they're going back to the East versus West, but we shall see what happens. And also, not just the All-Star game, but also what's big, what represents the All-Star weekend is the events such as the three-point shootout. We'll get into that in just a little bit, but we got something different this year. We have Stephen versus Sabrina. We'll have Stephen Curry go up against Sabrina Ionescu, who represents the WNBA's New York Liberty in a three-point challenge. Steph will shoot from the NBA three-point line with NBA-sized basketballs. Ionescu will shoot from the WNBA three-point line with WNBA-sized basketballs. This is interesting right here. What's your thoughts on Stephen versus Sabrina?
So for people who have not necessarily been following Sabrina Ionescu's career, since her college days at Oregon, if you haven't been, the following might surprise you, but if you've been following Sabrina's career, it doesn't surprise you at all to hear that her immediate reaction to the news that you mentioned about Steph shooting from the NBA line and Sabrina shooting from the WNBA line, her immediate reaction was, let me shoot from the NBA line, which is just so telling of who Sabrina is as a player. I mean, she's been a star of the WNBA essentially since she came into the league. And, of course, the New York Liberty, being a WNBA finals team last year, Sabrina was a huge part of that. I mean, she's been one of the, clear stars of women's basketball for quite a while now. And I think it'll be a lot of fun for people who are not as familiar with her game to see how incredible of a shooter she is, see how ridiculously competitive she is, genuinely one of the most competitive people in the world. And, it'll be, sort of more it'll be easier to sort of see her, doing well in this contest with the ball on the line that she's familiar with. But it's not surprising at all to me that her immediate reaction was, no, I want to compete, from the NBA line. I want to compete with the NBA ball. Let me, challenge Steph directly on that front. And, also, I mean, she's a Bay Area native who's been a Warriors fan and a Steph Curry fan for, most of her life. So I'm sure it's incredible for her to get to compete against Steph in this contest. But for people who aren't familiar with her game, do not be surprised at all to see her talking a truly absurd amount of trash when it gets time to the three-point shootout between her and Steph Curry.
This should be interesting. I think this could be one of the highlights of this year's NBA All-Star Weekend. And we have our skills challenge, and these gentlemen, hey, you can pick any one of these players. They have an opportunity to do something in this competition. We have Team Pacers with Tyrese Haliburton, Benedict Mathurin, and Miles Turner. And we have Team Top Pick, Paolo Banchero, Anthony Edwards, and Victor Wembanyama. And then Team All-Stars, Scotty Barnes, Tyrese Maxey, and Trae Young. Any thoughts that you may have on the skills challenge?
I mean, for me, of course, Tyrese Haliburton is going to be the star of the show, but that's really just for me. I think it's fascinating that they put together the team top picks with, two guys in Paulo and Anthony Edwards that are playing in the All-Star game, another guy in Victor who's going to be there sooner rather than later. But, again, it's fascinating that for the skills challenge, you're seeing a 7'4" big man in his rookie year, right? But that's just the incredible, versatility and, again, never before seen element of Victor Wembanyama, essentially being a 6'6" wing in a 7'4" center's body. And, it's always fascinating to see him handle the rock. And certainly that'll be a huge part of the fun for me of watching the skills challenge. But I mean, honestly, in terms of who I think might have a chance to win the thing, I think that Team All-Stars with, Scotty Barnes, with Trae Young, and, those guys, I think they will have the advantage heading into this game. I mean, between Trae and Maxey, they have guys who can handle the ball. They have guys who are exceptional passers. And certainly if, I had to predict who was going to come out on top in the skills challenge, I think I would go with Team All-Stars.
Yeah, that Team All-Stars team is phenomenal, not just with Scotty Barnes, but, man, Trae Young, as you said, his ball handling skills. And Tyrese Maxey is like the human tornado. He can just fly up and down that court, and certainly it should be into skills challenge. My favorite part of the All-Star weekend, the three-point contest. We have Malik Beasley from the Milwaukee Bucks. Also, we have Damian Lillard from the Milwaukee Bucks. We've got Jalen Brunson representing the New York Knicks. We've got Tyrese Haliburton representing the Indiana Pacers, Lauri Markkanen representing the Utah Jazz. We've got Donovan Mitchell from the Cleveland Cavaliers. We have Trae Young from the Atlanta Hawks and Karl Anthony Towns from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Your thoughts on the three-point contest?
It's funny. I thought Damian Lillard said that he was retiring from the three-point contest after he won last season, and yet here we are again with Dame. And it's hard to bet on anybody but Dame winning this contest. He's made it a staple of his incredibly storied resume that he's one of the best three-point shootout competitors we've ever had. So, it's one of those things where, again, it's hard to pick anyone besides him, but this is a star-studded lineup of three-point shooters. I mean, Malik Beasley, leading the league in three-point percentage, 47%, I believe, at one point this season. He's someone who has been a real find for this Bucs squad, and in a team that's had a lot of chaos this season, adding Malik Beasley has been a huge part of their success. His three-point percentage is down a little bit over the last couple of weeks, but that's still only down to 44%. He's been one of the best three-point shooters in the NBA this season, and he's been huge for a Milwaukee Bucks team that really has been able to take advantage of his ability to space the floor around Damian Lillard and around Giannis Antetokounmpo. So, certainly not surprising to see both of those Bucks guys in the competition. I'm always rooting for Tyrese Haliburton, so that's not particularly a surprise. If Keegan Murray had been in the contest, maybe I'd be rooting for him instead, but that's a different matter. With Karl Anthony Towns, you've got someone who's, again, one of the best big man shooters of all time, someone who's won the contest before, certainly someone who I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to repeat in this one. And then, Lauri Markkanen, one of the best three-point shooting 7-footers in the league, certainly someone who's got a shot in any sort of competition like this. And then, finally, 3 all-star guys who, again, definitely could make hay in this three-point shooting contest. I mean, Trae Young has been one of the best three-point shooters in the league for a very long time now. Certainly wouldn't be a surprise to see him take home the title. Donovan Mitchell, we talked about the incredible season that he's having, the incredible season that the Cleveland Cavaliers are having, and similarly for Jalen Brunson, just a spectacular season for him and for the New York Knicks. So, when picking winners, even though I love Tyrese Haliburton, it's hard for me to bet against Damian Lillard in this contest. And, it's funny that he's immediately back in it after, I hope I'm not misremembering him saying that he was done with it after he won last year, but always nice to see him back in the contest, and certainly I think he's going to be the favorite to take it home again.
Larry Bird, Craig Hodges, Mark Price, Ray Allen, Dirk Nowitzki, Paul Pierce, oh my gosh, Steph Curry, Kevin Love, Kyrie Irving, Klay Thompson, Karl Anthony Towns are just some of the players, including Devin Booker, are just some of the players that have won the three-point contest. And certainly Damian Lillard has an opportunity to go back-to-back this year. But like you said, Nick, there's been so many great players. There are so many great players in this contest, in this year's contest alone. And, man, hey, you can take anybody, Damian Lillard, Tyrese Haliburton, anyone. It's just definitely interesting, and certainly we've got a great one this year. And now for the slam dunk contest, Jaylen Brown from the Boston Celtics. We also got Jacob Toppin from the New York Knicks. We have Jaime Jaquez Jr. from the Miami Heat, and last year's champion, Mac McClung from the G League. Your thoughts on the slam dunk contest?
I'm excited about this year's slam dunk contest. I think part of that is because Mac McClung really put on a show last year, and having him back in the dunk contest is a no-brainer, even if he's, not on an NBA roster right now. But really the main reason I'm excited for this year's dunk contest is that Jaylen Brown is participating, and, having a top-flight all-star in the dunk contest is something that hasn't necessarily happened over the past few years. And so to see, a top-of-the-line all-star, all-NBA guy in Jaylen Brown, coming back and doing the dunk contest, it's giving me hope that, he won't be the last sort of face of the league guy that we see taking on the challenge of the dunk contest. And, with Jacob Toppin, I mean, his brother Obi won the dunk contest 2 years ago, so not particularly surprising to see Jacob Toppin competing in this game, just absolutely spectacular, high-flying athlete, because we saw Mac McClung put on the show he did in last year's dunk contest. I think it's safe to say that Jacob Toppin is probably the least heralded dunker in this group, but, he's certainly someone who, he has the athleticism to really put on a show in this contest, and certainly with the family history, he'll probably be asking big brother Obi for tips on how to win the thing. But with Jaime Jaquez, I mean, I talked about him already, with the Rising Star stuff, but he's had a spectacular season for the Miami Heat, and, if you see some of his warm-up videos, he throws down 350 dunks with ease, so he's someone who I expect to, have a real dark horse chance to sort of take the dunk contest title. But if I had to pick a favorite, I mean, just given how far ahead of the field he was in last year's dunk contest, how clearly focused he is on being a showman, and certainly, someone who I'm willing to bet has put in the most time working on their dunks in this year's slam dunk contest field, it's hard for me to bet against Mac McClung here, but just purely for the sake of making future dunk contests better, I would love to see Jaylen Brown win this and, make it a clear point to other All-Stars that, hey, you shouldn't back out of the dunk contest because you might be embarrassed that you'll flub a dunk. This is, a lot of people want to see the stars of the stars compete in the dunk contest. And, again, there have been a few sort of down years for the dunk contest. I think last year was one of the better ones we've had in this past 5-10 years or so, but for the dunk contest to really come back into being, sort of an All-Star weekend highlight like it's been throughout the course of All-Star history, I think a lot will depend on whether Jaylen Brown can prove to other All-Stars that, this is not only something that, you shouldn't be sort of shying away from, but it's something that you should be embracing. And, having the face of the league, one of the all-star, all-NBA guys winning a dunk contest, I think would be great for the future of the contest. So if I had to bet money on it, I would probably bet on Matt McClung, but my hope is that Jaylen Brown wins this thing in a landslide and, hopefully convinces other top-of-the-league guys to come back and compete in the dunk contest going forward.
I think this is going to be a better contest this year than last year. It was not so long ago when the slam dunk contest was the creme de la creme of the All-Star weekend, but the three-point contest in recent decades has superseded that. But we'll see, as you mentioned about Jaylen Brown, maybe this would encourage other high-profile NBA superstars to get back in the slam dunk contest. And that's our NBA All-Star Weekend with the game and including the great events such as the Slam Dunk Contest, the three-point shootout, and, of course, the Skills Challenge. I want to ask you now, Nick, just about Indianapolis. The city of Indianapolis is hosting this year's All-Star Game. We talked about New York and New York being passionate about a lot of things, and they love their basketball. But the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis, that history with basketball is phenomenal, and they love their basketball as well. Give me your thoughts on Indianapolis hosting this year's All-Star Game.
It's definitely a city and a state that loves their basketball, and it's great to see that the Pacers are, a good and fun team this year when, they do have the All-Star Game in Indianapolis, but certainly just, even in the weeks leading up to the event, it was very clear that this was something that meant a lot to the people of Indiana, to the people of Indianapolis. And, again, maybe it's not, as sort of top-of-the-line glitz and glamour as L.A. and New York in terms of markets, but, there's a lot to be said for how much basketball means to the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. And certainly that alone, I think, will make this a really fun all-star environment because, there are going to be a lot of people there who desperately want to be there, are so happy that the game is in their city. I think there'll be a lot of energy in the building for all of the all-star events, which, is something that is true pretty much any year, but especially this year, in a city that, doesn't get as much shine as some of the other American metropolises. For a city and a state that loves basketball as much as Indiana does, it'll certainly be a lot of fun to have the All-Star Game in Indianapolis. And, again, I expect it to be very lively crowds throughout all of the events because there are going to be a lot of people who are very happy to see the All-Star Game here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of tradition, not just in Indiana, but the city of Indianapolis when it comes to their basketball. And certainly they love their Pacers. And you hit the nail on the coffin. The team has played well this year, and certainly they have a lot to celebrate. But just basketball fans have a lot to celebrate with this year's NBA All-Star Weekend being in Indianapolis. And speaking of the Pacers, I have to briefly talk about Tyrese Haliburton. Recently, he criticized the 65-game minimum rule in the NBA for those that may have been living under a rock. The 65-game minimum rule was a measure that was passed during the new collective bargaining agreement where if players wanted to qualify for end-of-the-season awards, whether it be MVP, All-NBA, Defensive Player of the Year, they would have to play in a minimum of 65 games and have to play at least over 20 minutes in the required game rule. I want to ask you, Tyrese had said that the rule is too much, the players are tired. I'm just paraphrasing what he said, but that was kind of like in the arena that he was saying in. What are your thoughts on Tyrese's criticism of the 65-game rule?
I think he's completely right. At the same time, I think it was a good idea for the NBA to look into something like this. Essentially that there's a perception, and it's not entirely wrong, that, NBA teams are resting their starters when they're, not injured, but, just sort of giving them rest time to make sure that they're ready for the playoffs, to make sure that they're ready for, sort of premier matchups that they might have. So, I get why the NBA was considering this as a potential idea. So I think the idea is fine in a vacuum, but the way they're implementing it, I am totally on board with what Tyrese said. I'm really not a fan of it. There's been, rumblings that a lot of why certain players were, playing games a bit hurt, the past few months have essentially been because they want to meet those thresholds. And certainly that was something that was said about Joel Embiid in particular, where he was, not playing at 100% health just so that he can make sure that he qualified for MVP at the end of the season. And, of course, I can't say that, the rumors of him playing somewhat hurt led to, what ended up happening with his season-ending injury. But I think this kind of rule really penalizes the players who, have slightly more health struggles than others. I mean, there are guys like Anthony Davis, right, who we've talked about, who, will reliably miss, a few game stretches every season with, some sort of minor injury. I don't think it's particularly fair to penalize the Anthony Davises and the Kawhi Leonards of the world just for, not having as great of a health situation as an Iron Man type, a LeBron James, a Mikal Bridges, a AC Green back in the day, right? I don't think it's fair to, penalize guys who don't have as immaculate health records as others. I get where the NBA was coming from with this, decision to implement this 65-game threshold, but I think there has to be a better way of going about it than the way they're going about it now. And it'll be interesting to see just how long this threshold lasts, because certainly Tyrese Haliburton is not the only person in NBA circles who doesn't particularly agree with the implementation of the rules. So hopefully the NBA can figure out a better way to convey the concept that they're trying to convey with this 65-game minimum of, hey, if your star guys are healthy, they should be playing, right? I get that conceptually, but I agree with Tyrese. This is the wrong way of going about it, and I hope they change at least some of the details around this threshold sooner rather than later.
I don't know. I disagree with you on that. I really thought they should have made it at least 70 games. And I think the reason why the NBA made this move was basically to award the fans the right to see their favorite players be in the NBA. I think if people have paid a lot of money, regardless of what cities they're living in, whether it be major markets or small markets, I think they have the right to want to see a Joel Embiid or a Nikola Jokic or a Tyrese Haliburton or even a Zion Williamson or maybe a Jason Tatum. I think the fans are definitely owed that, right? When we have to take into account in terms of whether you're driving or taking public transportation, and not to mention you're paying for parking passes, and not to mention concessions and drinks and things of that nature. So, I mean, I get what Tyrese is saying, but honestly, I feel that it should have been increased to 70 games. And I think as from an athletic standpoint, when a player is starting and stopping like that, injuries can increase. So I don't know. I'm not a fan of it. I mean, I respect his comments wholeheartedly, but I just think that the fans and media like us, I think we're deserving of covering those players and the stories and things of that nature. But nevertheless, he's Nick Agar-Johnson, editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, also host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and he's the co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast covering the Sacramento Kings. Thank you so much, as always, Nick. Tell everybody what's going on over at No Ceilings and Kings Weekly.
Absolutely, Ed. Thank you so much for having me back on the show. It's a joy, as always, to talk basketball with you. You can find me on Twitter at NBA Johnson. I put up all of my work there, whether it be for No Ceilings, which, of course, you can check out at NoCeilingsNBA.com. And, we also, of course, have the No Ceilings NBA podcast, which I host the deep dive show for on Wednesdays. And then Kings Weekly, it's a relatively new show that I'm hosting with Ray LeBove, who basketball fans might know from the Basketball Intelligence newsletter. That's been a ton of fun. We've had some awesome guests this season. As someone who grew up in New York and has had the Brooklyn Nets as my second team really since I started following basketball, it was truly the honor of a basketball media lifetime to get to have a podcast interview with Sarah Kustok, the Brooklyn Nets commentator. Just so much fun. We've had some other amazing guests this season, Jim Peterson of the Minnesota Timberwolves, Bob Rathbun of the Atlanta Hawks, just incredible fun to have that podcast, talking about the Kings, also talking about, the NBA as a whole and some of the teams that the Kings are playing. We've had some wonderful guests. It's been a ton of fun to do that show, and you can find Kings Weekly on Twitter at Kings Weekly Pod, and you can find the Kings Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks again, Nick. And one more time, tell everybody where they can find you on social media, as well as No Ceilings NBA, Kings Weekly, any websites. Let the listeners know that as well.
Absolutely. So again, you can find me on Twitter at NBA-Johnson. No Ceilings is at No Ceilings NBA or NoCeilingsNBA.com or No Ceilings TV for any YouTube listeners / watchers. And Kings Weekly is at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter and the Kings Weekly Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard it from him. He's Nick Agar-Johnson. He is the editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, also co-host of the he's the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and he's the co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast, covering anything and everything related to the Sacramento Kings. Nick, this was fun as always.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. Always great to talk All-Star Weekend with you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the channel. Remember to click like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.